All right. So switching gears now, I'm really excited to be able to bring together this panel of folks from the government to talk really broadly about spectrum R&D challenges, spectrum workforce challenges, and collaborative networks that have been developed and that are continuing to grow and develop to address some of these major spectrum challenges. So this is not just about SpectrumX. SpectrumX is one collaborative network, but there are others. So the way I'm going to plan to run this session is as follows. So I'll introduce the panelists very briefly using this slide. I'll offer a few opening comments as the moderator of the session, and I'll drive the conversation to some degree with some questions that I've prepared and shared with the panelists. But my goal is very much to encourage the audience to start getting involved in the discussion and asking questions. And so I'll be checking the time. We're scheduled to do about an hour and a half panel here. So I'm going to try to reserve at least a half hour, if not more, time for some discussion with the broader audience. If I could ask each of the panelists to turn on their video, if that's possible, we'd like to spotlight you so that everyone can see you as I introduce you. So joining us today for this panel are Mr. Charles Cooper, the Associate Administrator of the Office of Spectrum Management at NTIA, Ira Keltz, Acting Chief of the Office of Engineering and Technology at the FCC. We got a 2-for-1 deal from the Department of Defense, and I'll go into more details about that in a little while, but Dr. Tom Rondeau, Principal Director of FutureG from the DoD Office of Undersecretary of Defense, Dr. Martin Weiss, who's Director of the FutureG Applied Research, several programs in DoD FutureG. And then we also have Mr. Dr. Duncan McGillivray from NIST. He's Program Director for Spectrum Science and also Program Director of NASTN at NIST. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for your time. Let me set the stage for the panel with a few opening comments here. So much of our modern lives depend upon applications of wireless technologies. Examples include connectivity, transportation, healthcare, science, public safety, and national security. As a result, radio frequency spectrum issues arise with increasing pace and complexity. From immediate FCC proceedings on specific bands to near-term federal budget considerations and spectrum auctions, to medium-term band studies and long-term planning and coordination around the national spectrum strategy, there is an awful lot to track and many opportunities for academic researchers and students to contribute. Fortunately, much groundwork has been laid to elevate the ability of academics to engage with government stakeholders and policymakers through collaborative networks. So, for example, the National Advanced Spectrum and Communications Test Network, or NASTN, is a joint effort among the DoD, NASA, NIST, NOAA, NSF, and the NTIA to provide a neutral forum for addressing spectrum sharing challenges. The National Spectrum Consortium, or the NSC, was launched to facilitate an other transaction authority, or OTA, with the Department of Defense. And it now maintains over 300 U.S. industry and academic members. I mentioned earlier today that the NTIA, FCC, and NSF created a memorandum of agreement in early 2021 to enhance the NSF Spectrum Innovation Initiative, of which SpectrumX is now a part. And as I said, we've developed into a network of 150 leading and developing researchers in academia looking at spectrum issues. And last but not least, the National Spectrum Strategy has been a comprehensive effort to leverage collaborative network. Sorry, we're getting feedback. And develop a proactive whole of government approach along several different so-called pillars. So this panel is going to reflect on our collective progress through these initiatives, identify priority R&D and workforce needs, and ideate on improving whole of government and industry, government, academia approaches to continue maximizing the societal benefits of wireless technologies and spectrum policy. So it's a tall mandate. Thank you all for joining. With that introduction, I'm just going to go ahead and ask each of you to very briefly introduce yourselves, tell us more about your role at your organization, what's keeping you busy these days, and then maybe tell us your favorite spectrum band or issue of the moment. Charles, you want to take it away?
What a setup there, Nick. Good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and really appreciate the invitation to be part of this with such a great group of colleagues, and also great topics, Nick. So thanks again, and hello to my fellow panelists. My name again, I'm Charles Cooper. I had the pleasure of running NTIA's Office of Spectrum Management, which we have kind of a twofold mission, right? The number one issue and responsibility we have is managing the federal spectrum. So what does that mean? Making sure our federal agency partners have sufficient spectrum to complete their missions, right? We're talking about Homeland Defense with the Department of Defense, NOAA with the National Weather Service and their radars and many other items, the FAA with their radars and communication systems, with NASA, and with many others, right? So that's quite a big task, number one. But our second task kind of tends to be a little bit interesting as well, as being the principal advisor to the president on telecommunications issue. And it was under that authority that we released the National Spectrum Strategy and doing our current work. So that's a kind of a brief summary, Nick, on what we're doing here, in terms of our mission structure. Kind of jumping, I think, to your last question, what's the favorite band that we have? That's a difficult one, right? Because we've got so many in play, not only with the band studies going on, but I was just reminded that we're still doing the final cleanup on the AWS bands, right? That goes back several years. It's been successfully deployed, but the agencies are still working through their final clearances on some of those bands. So I always say that, in spectrum management, our workload tends to always increase. It's very difficult to get a band to drop off for any consideration or changes to it. So we're kind of in a guaranteed growth trajectory here with our work processes. But thank you again, Nick, for the invite.
Thank you, Charles. Ira? Ira, we're not getting your audio, unfortunately. We can't hear you now. I'll move on, Ryra. Next up, Duncan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Duncan McGillivray. I'm with NIST, and again, thank you for inviting me to this panel. And so I'm with the Communications Technology Laboratory, specifically at NIST, which is housed in Boulder, Colorado. We tend to focus heavily on fundamental R&D type of products and problems. As far as spectrum is concerned, we are really coming out of an outgrowth out of traditional EMI, EMC kind of consideration, and then with the formulation of CTL, alongside with it came the formulation of NAST in order to bring together technical experts and interdisciplinary teams to really tackle very contentious and also very difficult spectrum problems. We got our first project out in 2016 on the GPS side of things, and since then I've been really being one project at a time, or 2 projects at a time. But as Mr. Cooper has mentioned, our workload tends to increase, and we're really looking forward to the next few months here as things get very heated very quickly. Yeah, again, thank you for inviting me, and looking forward to the discussion with the fellow panelists.
Thanks, Duncan. Want to come back and try again, Ira?
Yeah. Am I good now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. So yeah, my quick introduction. So I'm Ira Keltz. I'm the acting chief of the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology. Been around the FCC for quite a while and have worked on a whole host of things. If you name it, I've probably worked on it. So one of the couple things I just want to say by way of introduction, and I think somewhat important and a distinction that's often lost on folks who don't often do business in front of us or work with us. And as Charles had noted with NTIA and focused on the federal side, the FCC, by way of contrast, we deal with all the non-federal entities, including local and state government entities. So basically anybody who's not a federal user comes through us and subject to our regulation. So it sets up a very interesting dynamic with NTIA and other federal agencies, because most of the spectrum itself is shared between both the federal and non-federal side. And we do a lot of coordination among the agencies to make everything work. But again, they're very distinct agencies, and we have very distinct processes for how we go about our business. And I think it's important that people understand that. And I can't say that enough every time I talk to different groups, just to set some of the groundwork. As far as things that are happening today, just to jumping on what Charles said, there's a lot happening on the spectrum side, particularly looking to get more efficient, to get every last every last bit of efficiency that we can, and we are just really focused on doing a lot of that. And I think we'll get into some of that during the panel. And just to answer your last question about favorite band, and I was going to say my favorite band is whatever Charles's is, but he copped out and didn't say anything. So I'm going to cop out a little bit too, and just say, instead of a favorite band, what I really enjoy working on is kind of almost a big jigsaw puzzle that the spectrum is, with all its kind of little piecemeal parts. If you ever look at the spectrum chart, and figuring out how can we look at all those pieces and make them work together better. And I think that's a lot of what we're sort of focused on with the National Spectrum Strategy, is looking at all these different bands and all these different parts, and how can we change those, make them different, possibly move folks around if that's what's needed, to just make the whole system work better. I find that really interesting.
Thank you both. It's like a standard parent answer. I love all my children equally, right? I get it. All right, moving on. Tom Rondeau, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right, excellent. Yeah, so thanks for having us here. So Tom Rondeau, Principal Director for Future G, or Future Generation Wireless Technologies. I work for the DoD under the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. So what we're here to do is figure out how to securely and effectively leverage commercial wireless technologies for the Department of Defense. So I always bucket this into 2 groups, where we have the national security mandate of working for the DoD, supporting our warfighters, our warfighting and peacekeeping efforts all over the world. So how do we get access to this technology? That means existing commercial infrastructure. How can we deploy our own if we need to? How can we roll it out with us in scenarios where we want to use these types of technologies for their reliability, the bandwidth capabilities, the other technical features of them, as well as the readily accessible supply chains that the commercial industry gives us. So that's one aspect of it, but we also look at this from the national economic security of what this type of technology area could mean for us. It's huge business. and it is a globalized business. And there are certain key challenges that we face as far as our ability to operate within that as a country, and therefore, even though the supply chain is readily available, the trusted suppliers that we can work with, we're on the decrease. And so helping to work across the interagency throughout the U.S. with our international partners and allies, how do we build that back up and make sure that we have ready access to this, as well as help shape the future, the vision of the future for what this technology can mean. I always look at this as that a lot of the problems that we see in wireless and networking that are of commercial interest tomorrow are the DoD's problems today. And so we can hopefully be a bit of a vanguard in the deployment of these types of technologies and help them grow, learn, provide risk reduction, et cetera. So that's all, that's kind of the broad scope of what we do here. Spectrum is a big part of what we in the office do, and it's a big part of my life right now. And that's because the intersection of DoD spectrum needs and the bands in which DoD has operational use of the spectrum and commercial interests, they keep colliding. And so trying to figure out ways to mitigate that. I liked Ira's jigsaw puzzle analogy. So how do we be part of that conversation? Because again, it's not just about preserving DoD's national security enterprise, but how to make that more survivable itself, but also how we ensure that we have a robust economic support for the technologies that go behind the tech that we want to build and use. And so there's a lot of stuff that happens with Spectrum and this commercial versus kind of DoD spectrum. And by the way, now that I've got with Coop and Ira on the line here, I was at NATO a couple years ago now, briefing them on the work that we've been doing in 5G. And I mentioned civilian versus DoD spectrum, and Major General, the NATO representative from Sweden, she asked me, I don't understand what you're talking about, military versus civilian. The physics say it's all the same spectrum, right? And I had to explain how we regulate in the two different bodies that overlook it, and how we have to negotiate all this between our competing objectives and systems. So that was it seemed like an interesting lesson for them to learn. But anyways, as for my favorite band, I'm going to say the Talking Heads. Or
noted.
thinking about spectrum bands. So the one that really has our attention right now is the lower 3 gigahertz band, 3.1 to 3.45, and not just because there's so many of the military, DoD systems that operate in that band, but specifically because we're running the dynamic spectrum sharing demonstration. So that is, I can talk a little bit about the construct of it, but it is in source selection right now. So there's not a whole lot of details I can give you on exactly what we're going to do or exactly who's going to be performing on that, on building those prototypes. But that is where my interest really lies, is or focused right now is on that band. What can we do to actually enable real sharing tested against multi-domain systems in a complex environment at a scale that we've never tested this kind of dynamic spectrum sharing in the past. So it'll be an exciting kind of year and a half for us on that one moving forward. So thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Martin, did you want to jump in real quick?
Yeah, I'll just make it real quick. Thanks, Nick. And, it's nice to be with, my friends and colleagues from SpectrumX once again. It's always a pleasure to work with the center. I'm also in the OUSD R&E Future G, work for Tom Rondeau. I'm the Director of Applied Research. In that office, I'm responsible for topics such as Open RAN, workforce development, and also integrated sensing and communications. And it's really the Open RAN and the integrated sensing and communications parts that have gotten most of my bandwidth these past few days. As some of you may know, we're about to launch a procurement for an open source code base for the CU and DU part of the Open RAN stack. So that's been a lot of work, and we're also engaging with industry to help us determine, what research priorities, investment priorities around integrated sensing and communications need to be. And we've gotten some great feedback from a lot of people, and we look forward to sharing that feedback with you in the coming months. So as for my favorite spectrum band, so I'm torn here, right? I mean, I have the 1795 to 1810 is such an old friend. I've done a lot of research in that. So, do you give up an old friend for a new band like the C band? I don't know, Nick. I just don't know. Anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Martin. All right. So Emily, if you don't mind spotlighting the panelists that at least have their video on. Tom and Martin, can you add your video, or you're not in a position to do so?
Unfortunately, I am in my office in the Pentagon and do not have a camera.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm on my government computer, so camera is turned off on that.
Well, for the broader audience, I can verify. I recognize their voices. It's Tom Rondeau and it's Martin Weiss, so we can move forward. All right, so thank you all once again. I'm sure there's many, many things going on. You're all very busy, as we are. But, this is a great opportunity to take a step back, and I'd like to get your take on our collective progress through these collaborative networks, NASTN, National Spectrum Consortium, the partnership or the memorandum of agreement between NTIA, FCC, and NSF, SpectrumX, the National Spectrum Strategy. How are we doing at getting our nation's brightest minds contributing to progress in wireless technologies and spectrum policies? What can we call wins? And where is more attention and focus needed from all of us? Anyone want to jump on that first?
Well, since I hate quiet, I will jump in. So thanks. Yeah, I think all these programs that you mentioned have been really interesting. In a lot of them are actually relatively new, although not completely new anymore. But in particular, in the last couple of years, some of the things that I've seen that I think have been really helpful, really beneficial, is coming out of the National Spectrum Consortium, sponsored what we called the PATHS, PATHSS. That, don't ask me what the acronym stands for because I never remember. But what it did for the first time is, in studying that lower 3 gigahertz 3.1 and 3.45 that Tom mentioned earlier, it did a really nice comprehensive study that brought together both the DoD interested folks, academics, and the industry folks from the commercial side, both from the carriers as well as people looking at dynamic spectrum who operate in the CBRS band, operate some of the databases that the commission has authorized. And we met for probably a year and a half or so, and did some really good work to do some modeling and get a lot of inputs and work collaboratively between those three groups. And it was something completely different than anything we'd done before. And I thought we made a lot of progress in, one, building trust among different groups. I think folks are still wary, the old trust but verify. But in a way, it brought about, I think, a good understanding from all sides of how the other folks are working to get a sense of, how can we make better use of the spectrum, and how can we, in this case, are there ways to share spectrum? Are there ways to do it dynamically? Which kind of ties in, as Tom talked about, this big dynamic sharing study and demonstration that they're looking to do. And all of this kind of keyed off, I think, a lot of that work. I mean, there's still a lot to do, but so in my mind, that, at least as far as recent examples, that might be the most valuable of all that has come out of this. And I think it's also created a process that we'll be able to capitalize on going forward to have all these groups collaborate in a really effective manner.
I would say within OSM, we're always looking to broaden the number of resources we have available. Likewise with all of our teams, right? We got an extremely capable staff, multidisciplinary in many aspects, which is probably increasingly needed here in the spectrum management world. And what I mean by multidisciplinary areas, beyond the standard technical engineering, but looking at the economics, looking at the legal aspects. Those are every day becoming increasingly important to integrate into our final assessment. But yes, I mean, through OSM, we have really appreciated our strong collaboration with NSF and SpectrumX. Furthermore, we're actually sponsoring several projects that are kind of really important to us, to get that broader awareness and that broader level of expertise. I think there'll be briefings later on today, I think starting at 3:00, talking about some of those proposals. But some of them, I think are kind of immediately obvious, like working with 5G sharing techniques, with Notre Dame. Value-based spectrum, again, looking at the economics piece, and as I mentioned, from the multidisciplinary aspects, which I think Northwestern is tagged for that. Also our Spectrum Laboratory, right, ITS, not only they do the work, but they're also working with NSF and SpectrumX to work on projects with regard to spectrum cartography, information and standards at their Table Mountain kind of radio quiet zone, and kind of what my perpetual favorites as well, tropospheric propagation, which deals kind of with those more unusual propagation characteristics. And as we're looking at higher bands, trying to determine, the probability and mechanisms that tropospheric effects occur. And then likewise with another one for OSM will be machine learning and AI, which we're working with the University of Virginia on. So they're kind of very exciting projects. And again, hope you don't mind, Nick, but I'm giving a plug for folks to listen to later on today to hear how some of those are going. But that's not only through NASTN, not only through through the other mechanisms mentioned, but I see that as a very strong tie, for the academic side here within OSM.
No, we'll take the plug, Charles. Thank you. But just as a point of information, those briefings are tomorrow afternoon.
Oh,
Eastern.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification. So tomorrow afternoon, hear about some of those ongoing work processes that we're funding for OSM.
Thank you, sir. We've heard NASTN a few times. Duncan, as the new program director for NASTN, do you want to add some perspective on the progress that's been made through that vehicle?
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the pieces that really stand out to me is really the soft science of things, building the relationships, the connections to really formulate these interdisciplinary teams. Certainly NSC has kicked off a lot of that. We're seeing some of the benefits of that. Interactions with OSM are hugely informative to making sure that the work that we're doing in NASTN are relevant, but then also that the R&D that's going to get done in CTL is going to be informing a larger picture. So right now we're doing a spectrum science road mapping effort internally to CTL. We've convened with several folks. Some of them are within SpectrumX, and Rick Reeser invited me, and that's why I'm here. So, and along with your invitation, Nick, of course. But it's important for us to understand where NIST can fit and bring fundamental to insights on certain problem spaces. Again, we're mostly on the RF side, EMI, EMC, some of the modeling, some of the dynamic spectrum sharing concepts are not foreign. We understand that there's a significant need going to be there on modeling and simulation in terms of bringing that in. As far as NASTN is concerned, and we tend to build smaller teams, no more than about 25 people or so, to take on a spectrum sharing challenge at a time. And then we disband after the project. And we have a core set of staff internal to us that remain to maintain the capability. But I think it's really interesting to see that folks come to the table with new creative ideas out of industry, ideas that come through vehicles such as SpectrumX and literature that we can try and address in a more formal type of structured scientific investigation, right? So it's been a very exciting time, and I think there's a lot of work ahead of us, and a lot of new bands are being considered. So there's bound to be a lot of questions. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to get a couple questions out of these new spectrum efforts in 3.1 to 3.45 and et cetera, here in the near term.
Well, and you're in the process of evaluating the CBRS 1.0. And of course,
so yes, it's really we are within that realm. So we have a project ongoing that's been ongoing for about 4 years now. It's a longitudinal investigation with spectrum monitors on the East Coast and West Coast. We've got about 4 sensors on each coastline, plus 2 in Boulder for R&D and 1 in Bedford, Massachusetts. The team is comprehensive. It involves a technical expert out of NTIA ITS, the MITRE Corporation, NASA Langley Research Center, and then of course NIST staff as well. It's really taking a look into what has been published, what are the reference implementations out there out of the WinForm mechanism. Can we apply these mechanisms? Do we see real world changes to incumbent systems or what we would suspect to be incumbent systems? Do those make sense? And we're generating a fair amount of data out of these sensors on a daily basis. That's going to come out here shortly, probably within the fiscal year or so for the first tranche of data sets. The data is very complex. We're trying to focus on things such as nobody really wants to sift through IQ, especially not from 10 or 12 sensors. So how do you structure that better? So we've really focused on developing new edge compute products and also trying to bridge the gap a little bit in these edge compute products between what typically is done in spectrum monitoring efforts, such that regulators such as NTIA and FCC can look at the data set and see what might be more representative of what they believe to be in the environment by looking at not maxes and peak holds or medians and means, but also filling in the statistics, so percentile-based spectrum.
I think I hear a really compelling Radio Shop chat opportunity. Once you guys have your data and you start to analyze it, we should queue up a briefing for our broader community to see how we might tie in and learn from that data and start to apply some of our tools to that data.
Absolutely.
Tom Martin, did you want to jump in on this first question about progress with these collaborative networks, or should we move on?
Yeah, no. So we've been doing a lot in this space, and I mentioned the DSS, and that is a cross-governmental or interagency challenge that we're working on, and we are trying to bring in and build the community up around this. So that's one of the kind of more exciting things I think we're going to try to do here is, across the DoD, we're in charge of that the effort. We're going to be funding the building of these prototypes, the performer base, but we're also going to be building across the entire military services how to make sure that we're bringing in the right assets, the right experimental equipment, creating the right experimental designs, and all that stuff to help us. But I'm also wanting to make sure that we stay in touch with the interagency in order to make sure that everyone's kept up to speed on progress and knowledge of what we're doing. And importantly, in this case, we're bringing in the telcos, and we're going to try to get them as part of the team, contractually part of the team, so that they can help us build, or at least be aware of and analyze and the experiments, the data, the test plans, all of that, so that nothing is a surprise to them, or they're part of the success instead of kind of just being handed a solution at the end of it. So yeah, I think in this case the community is really important. It's one of the things that I think we all here love about Spectrum, that is either hated by everybody else or not well understood, which is it was mentioned before, the multidisciplinary aspect of it. Somebody kind of a layperson on the side who maybe understands enough about wireless and RF and physics, and they look at spectrum problems, they're just like, well, why wouldn't you everybody has a solution, why don't you quote just do this? And then you have to look at them and go, well, if we go back 30 years or we go back 50 years, or we go back 90 years, and you got to look at the policy, the economics, the business, the markets. All of these things play a role here that make this whole like a layer challenge. And I don't think we're going to get anywhere successfully if we just play this as an engineering experiment and don't consider bringing in the people who are impacted on the other side, which are the services on the DoD side and the businesses from the commercial side. So that's one way that we're trying to layer this. The other way is just through the other spectrum sharing projects that we've been managing out of the office for a number of years now. There's various portions of this, and in fact, it's not unrelated to what we're doing in DSS, which is effectively 3 categories of types of sharing models. Cooperative, where the 2 sides talk to each other, non-cooperative, and it's non-cooperative, not uncooperative. They're not trying to be adversarial, they're trying to but work on their own side. And then simultaneous coexistence. And different technologies and different approaches that matter when you're trying to solve different, or how to solve the same problem, or different technologies that might help us solve different problems. Or another way to look at it is potentially a layered approach, whereas we layer on ideas of simultaneous transmit and receive, as well as spatial beamforming and spatial manipulation of the spectrum, and dynamic sharing of the assets based on time, frequency, and location. Then we, I think, start to have something that's very complex. But as we've been pushing the technology and been adopting new and novel technologies, we see paths forward for us to be able to better utilize this resource. So I don't know if Martin wants to talk more about any of the specific research projects we've been running.
Excuse me. Well, I can add a little bit. I mean, we do a fair amount on the interagency side. I mean, we're active participants in Wizard. We meet often with folks who are at NSF and NTIA, and so we really value the collaborations that we have there. But I think the only thing I would add to Tom is what Tom said is that it's not just about communications. I mean, so one of the key ideas behind the integrated sensing and communications, for instance, is that you can use a waveform for multiple things. In this case, you could use it for identifying objects, physical objects, or identifying weather phenomenon, or so forth. And so this ability to utilize a waveform for more than one, I think, ends up improving our use of spectrum efficiency, because it forces us to rethink what we communicate, how we sense, how we integrate all of these kinds of things. But, again, that's really just supplementing what Tom said.
Yeah, a lot of the discussion here is kind of going into the direction, which is another one of my questions, of the R&D priorities. So in terms of near term, next 1 to 3 years or so, medium term, 3 to 5 years, and long term, 5 to 10 years, most of the audience is academic researchers looking for really good problems to tackle. Where should we be focusing our energies, right? I think Tom mentioned some beamforming, different modes of spectrum sharing, cooperative, non-cooperative. Martin mentioned integrated sensing communications. Duncan mentioned monitoring and trying to do data reduction, but still getting insights from that data. What are the directions that SpectrumX and the broader academic research enterprise needs to be focusing on in the next in these different phases of R&D timelines?
Another one to kind of bring up for consideration, and looking at it from managing the federal spectrum, right? We want to keep federal agencies interference free so they can complete their missions, right? And as the spectrum is getting more congested, either through increased federal use or commercial wireless activities or other commercial activities that come in the band, is how to account for aggregate interference. Kind of a long-standing issue here, but nevertheless, it still kind of causes a lot of hand-wringing in the spectrum community. Going back to my old broadcasting days, I'm really dating myself here, but for medium wave for AM, you would consider aggregate interference as the RMS, root mean square, as a summation of potential interferers. Not suggesting that's the case here, but that was something done, almost a century ago. But presently, I think a lot of the interference emitters are just kind of summed together algebraically, which that may be overstating the potential for interference. And also, how does the anomalous propagation fit into that? And that's why OSM is funding the part of the tropospheric propagation that's being done not only by ITS but also by Northwestern Junior College, looking at those impacts. So I would say, from OSM's perspective, not only the ones that were mentioned, which those are spot on, but the aggregate interference and also the kind of the more unusual or anomalous propagation mechanisms.
Yeah, and I'll add to that a thought. To retread a joke I've made once in another setting like this. Nick, you asked a technical question in 2025, therefore the answer must be AI. So. But I do really think that there's a lot of room for us to adopt
aggregate
tools
interference,
there.
of course.
There it is. Yeah, that's right. That's what I meant by AI. But like we've been working with the Spectrum Exchange team that grew out of the Spectrum Collaboration Challenge at DARPA, and has been running a small business that they spun out for this. And again, using advanced advanced AI, ML, whatever you want to call it, techniques to more effectively manage spectrum, and this is more for, again, a collaborative or coalition type scenario where everybody comes to the table. In our case, we're the DoD, so we bring a bunch of various forces, a joint force to a theater, sometimes with partners and allies operating alongside us, and you got to figure out how to deconflict that spectrum, and that is a very tough manual process right now. And they're doing it. They're feeding all the information and all the requirements in there, and then within a very short amount of time, spitting out an answer. And in actual field practice or experiments that we've had, the spectrum managers liked the answer. So using that to help for deconfliction and real-time planning of the use of these resources, I think is one that we've seen successful and have a lot of interest in pursuing and pushing on. The other one is, if we are going to do stuff like using these multimodal approaches of managing the spectrum resources, managing spatial access to resources, tying that in with the end user. Okay, if you're doing beamforming, you've got to, your transmitter has to hit your receiver, and how do you manage that successfully and with low resource to do it. Then you're going to add other aspects of it, which is aggregate interference, adjacent channel interference. How do you actually observe all this? These are going to be very multidimensional, complex decision models, and how do you solve those, and how do you address them? And again, in is more real time than we do today. I think using advanced compute concepts is something that we really need to study, and we need to apply our domain expertise onto the use of the magic fairy dust that is AI, and bridge those worlds together. So I think that there's utility there.
And Tom, I know you have to transition off the panel here because of another commitment. I do want to point out that there was a question in the chat about, could you take 30 seconds and explain the difference between cooperative sharing and simultaneous coexistence?
Yeah, so probably not the most well-defined terms. In fact, maybe I'll let Martin speak to some of the work that he's starting, which is to help us create a lexicon and a taxonomy of spectrum sharing ideas. But John, what I mean by this is cooperative is a space-time and frequency-based sharing. Let's call it, it's like CBRS, but maybe CBRS on steroids. Kind of what we're trying to do in dynamic spectrum sharing program is, how do we work between two or maybe multiple different systems and cooperatively come to a conclusion, a decision on who uses the spectrum, how much, when, and where. And so they cooperate on making those decisions. Whereas simultaneous is specifically related to what you could call it full duplex technologies, or simultaneous transmit and receive, or STAR technologies, where you can both transmit and receive at the same time. And therefore, if you're using this for rejecting your own transmissions, can we also use it to reject interference and subtract interference out of your systems? And so that's what I meant by simultaneous coexistence. I was really referring to star technology, and that's a really interesting space because there's a lot of, the concept has been around for a while. The success of it, there's a lot of technical nuances there. And a big one that we're working on through the Microelectronics Commons, not necessarily just for STAR, but in general, is making higher linearity receivers. So the more we can prevent our receivers from going nonlinear, the more we can effectively address challenges in the digital, just like the mathematical domain, and subtract them out of the system. But once you go nonlinear, things start to get mathematically really complicated. So hopefully that was enough of an answer to address that.
I'm sure that was music to ears of some of our research faculty for sure.
Wanted to drop that note in there. Yeah. So thanks for having me. I really apologize for having to drop out right now. The commitment to the Pentagon is a crazy place to be right now, as you could probably all imagine. But really happy to be here, and Martin's got my back for the rest of it.
Thank you so much, Tom.
So if I can add a little bit more nuance to what Tom said, I mean, so I put this in the chat. So when we talk about cooperative, we're really talking about deconfliction of use, perhaps, and often between multiple users. I mean, STAR technology doesn't require deconfliction because it's like a full duplex mode on a telephone line. You're sending and receiving bidirectionally at the same time, but it's normally, as we conceive it, it's within the same user. So you essentially get more utility out of the bandwidth that you have. I also kind of like, Tom, it was a bit of a misspeak, but the notion of non-cooperative, which, is, we might call it electronic warfare, right? It's jamming, it's those kinds of things. No, uncooperative is when you're actively opposing a communication effort. I mean, it's not really sharing, but if you want to fill out the big picture, you can't ignore it. In fact, Dale Hatfield and I have had a number of conversations about enforcement, especially in the non-cooperative versus the cooperative kinds of cases. Anyway, just I'll stop there, and we can happily chat about these things at another time.
Great. Any other R&D priorities? I mean, we have a national spectrum R&D plan, right?
I thought that my CML file was corrupted, but actually it was.
Sorry, if you're not on the panel, please mute.
Yeah. So, hey, Nick, thanks for mentioning that, because I was going to bring that up and note that there is a national R&D plan that came out of the National Spectrum Strategy that was done as a collaboration between NITRD and the Wizard Group. Folks can Google it, take a look at it. There's a lot of good information there that was gleaned from talking to a lot of folks to understand what's on people's mind, and it's broken into several different areas for innovation areas for what they call inspired research or fundamental research and so forth. Gets into front ends, antennas, receivers, interference resilience, and so on and so on. But back to some of what was said earlier, and maybe a couple comments on the spectrum sharing and maybe slightly different terminology. And one of the things we've talked about here is looking at it almost like open loop and closed loop, where CBRS, there's really no feedback. So you're trying to share the spectrum. It's being managed by a database, but I don't want to say it's being done in a vacuum, but there's no feedback loop to be able to adjust and improve, as you go along. And I think thinking about how to enable that feedback, what kind of information, how do you get it, could go tremendously towards improving some of the sharing and coexistence as we're trying to do dynamic spectrum sharing. Some of the other things that we're focused on and thinking about here at the Commission is improvements to propagation models to do better predictions as we're looking to allocate spectrum and develop service rules to try to get it right earlier in the process. There are a lot of times the rules get done and they're based on either not very good assumptions or skewed assumptions or just imperfect information. And and now maybe capitalizing on some AI and looking at some of this, there's ways to improve some of the models that we rely on, that to have a little bit more confidence and maybe not be as conservative in our assumptions going forward at the front end. So that's something I think I've got high hopes for seeing coming out in the future. And then the other thing that I've got, I guess, a curiosity on is, well, there's two things. So, one of the big issues the commission and NTIA, frankly, we've been dealing with over the years, and a lot of the big, spectrum, I'll call them fights for lack of a better word, but tend to get down to out of band emissions and receiver performance and those types of interactions. And I think one of the things that we'd like to get a better handle on are things. So we always start at worst case, assuming a transmitter's at full power, and then kind of state, well, if we reduce power, how do things improve? But I don't think it's a one-to-one relationship on the out of band, that if you for every dB you reduce your in-band power, does the out of band power reduce? I've seen things like it's 3-to-1, 5-to-1, but understanding that could really help. And similarly on out of band antenna performance, antennas are always characterized for in-band performance, but now when we're looking at out of band interactions, we used to always do conducted measurements, but we're more and more getting to radiated measurements, understanding what's actually happening as this wave is traveling out in the atmosphere. And the out-of-band performance of an antenna likely does not mimic the in-band performance, so the gain patterns may look different. And if there's a way to kind of understand that could help us in characterizing those out-of-band emissions for understanding what the effect is on adjacent systems. And I think those are places that we really lack a lot of good relevant information that could really help. And then the other thing I'll just mention, because talking to a research community, and the one thing that does get really difficult is the regulatory time frame is very different often than the research time frame. And I think one of the things that SpectrumX has been helpful for is trying to see how we could better match up some of those, and whether we can get some short-term projects for things that could really help us at the moment when we're soliciting comments and rulemakings, rather than we put out a proposal and unfortunately the research takes another year or two, and that it's great to have, but it doesn't help us at the time we might need it. And again, I'm always thinking how can we better sync those things up, and certainly open more suggestions, because I know it's hard, but it's something that I hope folks can focus on a little bit more, especially if there's quick things that can be done to help.
Yeah, that impedance match between the research timeline and the regulatory timeline is a key. Yeah. That's a goal that we all have to work on to try to tighten things up. So thanks for that comment. Duncan, did you want to add?
Yeah, I do want to add and pull on a couple threads of this. One of the things that was really mentioned was the need for some of the fundamental insights, such as antenna forming and or cellular base stations that are really in a closed loop environment, and you can't really operate a base station at its maximum capacity unless you have the end users with it. So it's a very, very difficult problem to really get into that, particularly as that starts informing aggregate interference type of situation, or aggregate emissions, I'd like to say. Additionally, with that, as we get towards the out of band contribution, we are now in an environment where we're heavily on TDD type of waveforms. And it's very difficult to really suss out in the real world now without really good time synchronization of what's going out in the field between what's happening on the downlink, what's happening on the uplink, and trying to make sense of it all. Focusing on the other AI, one, one of the things that really needs to happen is figuring out how can we present researchers with a sufficient amount of ground truth, right? AI is driven by labeling. How do we make sure that the labeling is done accordingly and sufficient confidence that you can train your models and have them run for you and do the interpretations and do the sussing out of spectrum allocations and so on, how you really want it. And, you know, the out-of-band emissions is not only just on the cellular side, it's really also on the incumbent sides. It's a huge problem with high power systems just because you can't beat physics. But then also, you know, from a spectrum use perspective on the receiver design, it really is coming down to best practices in receiver designs and making sure that your spectrum footprint is not only on transmit, it's also on the receive. And if you have to integrate across wider bandwidth and what's allocated to you, how do you do that appropriately, right?
We'll be in business for a while, I suspect, this research community of ours. Thank you all. I want to pivot a bit. We definitely want to make some opportunities for the audience to add some more questions. But I feel like I have to ask about the National Spectrum Strategy. It's been mentioned a couple of times. You know, there's the last 2 years, a significant amount of conversation, debate, writing, revising, working has been focused on this National Spectrum Strategy and its implementation plan. So could we possibly get your perspectives on the most important elements of the National Spectrum Strategy as you see them going forward, but also, you know, significant progress that has been made under that auspice of the implementation plan of the National Spectrum Strategy?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take this one first, Nick. You know, since
that's your prerogative, sir.
Yep, the strategy was released by the White House, but the implementation plan was released by Department of Commerce / NTIA. So, number one is kind of an observation, right? We have a new administration. The strategy was released by the former administration. Nevertheless, this administration is very focused on spectrum issues. It's kind of interesting because, you know, I've been at this for a few years now. So when a new administration comes in, typically spectrum work takes, you know, maybe not a year one primary activity, but not the case here, right? This administration is very focused on that, which we're excited about as well. You know, so there'll certainly be, I suspect, some elements that will continue to be a priority, right? The band studies, I suspect, will be one of those for sure. The research and development part, I think, is extremely important and one that will be advocated here. I mean, you know, as I already kind of touched on this as well with the R&D component of the National Spectrum Strategy. I mean, there are a total of 55 R&D opportunities that we flagged in that, which is an incredibly breadth in that. And, you know, as just with our own discussion, it kind of reiterates, you know, why there's so many of them, because there's so many exciting and interesting and important discussions that need to be researched. So, you know, certainly extending that research and development, I think, in my opinion, would be very helpful. You know, as well, we're working with our NTIA, our research arm, you know, the Institute of Telecommunication Sciences, ITS, and a test bed set up for spectrum sharing, and, you know, coming up with a framework of what that will look like with regard to the R&D plan and the National Spectrum Strategy. So I would say hang on. You know, I think there'll be news coming on that. But yeah, the spectrum is not going away. As a matter of fact, I think it'll become hang on to your seats even more fast paced than maybe what we have seen before.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just kind of jump on that a little bit too. You know, as you know, Charles said, you know, it's a new administration, and but from the commission standpoint, Chairman Carr has been laser focused on spectrum. You know, if anybody who's followed the commission over the last number of years, you know, as a commissioner, he was always had an opinion and pushing us to move on spectrum. As chairman, you know, he's certainly, you know, also pushing us. And you know, as Charles and I talk all the time, as you know, there is a lot happening, both what the groundwork that was laid for the spectrum studies, as well as, you know, the continuation of just constantly re-examining the spectrum. Obviously there are certain bands that people are focused on. Those don't change from administration to administration. From the commercial sector, and where they've got spectrum throughout the 3 gigahertz band, and they have made known their interest in the spectrum below 3.45 gigahertz, their spectrum moving up further into the 3.7 above 3.98 gigahertz, towards a little closer to the altimeters, as well as we've in the spectrum strategy and last we've talked about 7 gigahertz and a whole host of bands. So and I think the challenge is kind of where I started talking about the jigsaw puzzle type of thing. It's we've got all these pieces and they all have to kind of fit in some way, and it all has to work, and there's got to be a place for all of it. There's got to be a place for the commercial sector to operate. There's got to be a place for DoD to operate. We're also looking at how to make sharing, whether dynamic sharing or otherwise, work, as well as the unlicensed. We've grown Wi-Fi. The commission, we provided the 6 gigahertz band to expand Wi-Fi up above the 5 gigahertz uni bands that have been in place, and I think there's nothing is going to change us or move us from just all constantly looking across the board. But right now I think some of those bands I mentioned are the ones that are really in focus, that folks are really interested in at the moment. I don't think that's going to change, but even with that, we continue to look across the board at any opportunity we can find to provide more efficiency, have more users make use of the spectrum, enable coexistence in various ways.
Thanks, Ira. Others want to jump in on national spectrum strategy, or?
Yeah, I mean, just to add kind of not adding much new here. It is a new administration. We don't know if the spectrum strategy, what the current administration will do with the spectrum strategy. But that being said, I was on a panel at the Technology Policy Institute's Aspen meeting last summer, and the observation was that much of there was so much social capital and collective understanding built during the development of the spectrum strategies and the implementation plan that even if it doesn't have the same force as it did during the previous administration, a lot of the same themes and the same objectives will carry over because the people involved in it will largely carry forward and continue on based on the prior work that they did.
From my perspective, things haven't really changed much. What I've heard really is we have to go faster, right? How do we get the data out of the scientists and out of the labs in front of people who need to make the decisions, right? But really, what's also critically important is not dropping the insights and the nuances of making the puzzle pieces fit. You can't just carve out a new puzzle piece. You have to figure out how to shape it in the right direction. The implementation plan galvanized us at NIST, certainly. It certainly galvanized others across other federal agencies. We're recognizing that there's an opportunity to really work with the other bodies of the federal government towards cohesive targets. Right now, those targets are many of them, as was discussed, like there's a lot of opportunities. But what I'm trying to do internal to NIST is to figure out how can we take the opportunities and gaps and identify which ones can be done at the speed that are necessary to get out the door, and which ones are really more for the R&D projects and problems to focus on. So I'm really excited about this new chapter in the National Spectrum Strategy and its implementation because it is giving focus to the R&D across the federal government. It's also giving us an opportunity to collaborate across entities outside of the government to pull in the new ideas, particularly those that could bear out a lot of traction. And we have new technology tools now available to us that we didn't have in the AWS-3 days. We've certainly learned a lot from AWS-3. We've learned an awful amount from the early days of CBRS, We're still learning to this day on CBRS 1.0 transition to 2.0 what those impacts might be, how the aggregate emission is going to get shaped as you put sensors out into the field or look for incumbent operations and so on. So the building blocks are right there. It's to make sure that they're honed and crafted and go in the right direction.
All right, thank you all. Well, as I advertised at the start of the panel, I hope you're all okay with this. But I think it's important to give our audience an opportunity to ask a few questions. And I hope everyone is aware that, there may be some topics that we're not going to venture into too deeply, right, for various reasons. But with that being said, I think Renee has had her hand up for a while, so we'll start with Renee Leduc.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us today. Building on the last question, recognizing that there are pretty considerable changes going on inside of government, particularly related to staffing, both inside the civil service as well as inside of really the contracting force. And basically, while there has been considerable downsizing, there's likely going to be more forthcoming. I know that we have talked a lot inside of really SpectrumX about the shortage of basically RF engineers in terms of really the future, especially inside of government as well as in terms of their contractors. I want to provide one example of specifically all of the NOAA Satellite and Information Service, specifically NOAA NESDIS, which right now has no RF engineers amongst their federal staff, and they also have a lapsed contract associated with all of their sort of RF engineering services, and there are no plans to reinstate that. And so given that reality, and given particularly NTIA's role to really provide that sort of cooperative interagency sort of federal view of things, how are you going to deal with this situation in light of the fact that you don't have science expertise internally? I would also like to follow up specifically with basically FCC and say, given this, how are you going to be able to advise folks like Chairman Carr to be able to make the most appropriate decisions in light of these things, especially if you won't be getting as much analysis out of basically a range of different agencies?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and tackle this one here, Nick. At least parts of it here. Yeah. So scarcely a day goes by on our end about seeking new talent, seeking new expertise. We're all aware that we have a freeze to some extent on new hires, but eventually that will be lifted, right? Don't know when, but it's going to have to be lifted at some point, and we're going to have to get new expertise in here, absolutely. And I know, this is one of the issues that OSM and NTIA OSM is having good dialogue with SpectrumX on as well, is how could we increase the interest not only in Spectrum but also the potential new employees. I think though, and I think that this kind of goes without saying, I think we have a larger issue within the federal government on the pay scales that we offer engineers, particularly at the entry level, the lower GS scales, the lower government service scales for those that follow the GS. Many times the private industry can offer more to those new hires than what we're able to do on the federal side. That's a real challenge. And again, it's broader than Spectrum, right? So, I heard my boss here recently saying that's something that we should look into. Again, as a whole, maybe something that we can ask the White House to kind of look into as well when they get to that point. But I would love to hear thoughts on how we can make federal service, once we get to that point, right, more attractive, both economically and also from a mission oriented perspective. Because I think I think it's going to be increasingly important as every year progresses.
And just as a quick follow-up to that, I certainly hope that they recognize that that spectrum expertise needs to not only be inside of NTIA and basically FCC, but also inside of science agencies, because really our understanding is that that reopening of hiring is not going to happen inside of science agencies.
You said it's not going to happen.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I understand the science agencies, and also, speaking for, all the federal agencies that we work for, in terms of, beyond NASA and beyond NOAA, but, I can't speak for DOD, you have
right.
You got other folks on the line there for DOD, but also FAA and the others, they have to have that fundamental expertise. 100%.
Certainly.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Charles. Let's see, I think Federico had the next question there. I'm not going to read it. Federico, do you want to summarize the question?
Hi, everyone. So actually, it was just a little note on language. I come from a more game theory, computer science, or field, and I'm very happy to be working now with Randy and Mike. It was about the language and understanding, because in the chat we were talking about coexistence, cooperative, non-cooperative, and in truth, this is just a little note that a lot of times help clarifying what we want to describe, because usually cooperative means that there is some binding agreement, and this is usually when the resource is shared, and as much as the more the parts bring in, the more the added value increases. And non-cooperative could be also something that is not necessarily adversarial, for example, competing firms, for example, competing satellite firms that want to get access. But I think, in my understanding, that some folks were talking more from an adversarial perspective. So my suggestion was that probably we should use this language that could also help to bridge the communication between the engineers and the policymakers, perhaps, because usually policymakers have this kind of education. Yeah, just probably too much complicated. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for the comment. I hope we are keeping track of the transcript, so we'll bring that back to the team as we evolve terminology. It's often, very important to define what your terms mean as you're using them, unless otherwise people can run off with different interpretations of the same term.
Yeah, exactly. Avoiding creating new dialects. Yeah, I agree.
Indeed. Well, recognizing that there are some slight differences in dialect and then bridging them over time. Thank you for that. Let's see. I think Eileen was next. Eileen Yaner.
All right. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, everyone, for this very informative panel. So, nothing lasts forever. So we're so assume that all of these hiring freezes are gone one day, right? And we're in the process of right now giving you the next generation of spectrum engineers, researchers. What would be the one thing that you ask of the education workforce development effort of this center? What would be the one skill that you would need in your next hire, perhaps a couple of years down the line? And I think for Emily, I think this should count as 4 questions because it's asked to each of the agencies.
See, it's a game.
It is a game.
Any takers? Most important skill
Yeah, I'll take
for
this one.
SpectrumX to develop.
This skill is really a non-singular skill. It's really being able to work with cross-functional teams or interdisciplinary teams, recognizing when your strength is not the strongest one in the room and trying to figure out where the expertise else comes from. What I typically look for in hiring is looking for good understanding of fundamentals in electromagnetics to begin with. Number two, the curiosity to look for coding challenges and do code development, because a lot of the things have to be automated these days. There's no way around it. And thirdly is innate curiosity to build up intuition, being able to go outside with a spectrum analyzer, something like that, spectrum, curious, people and future hires. From a specific skill sets, I think spectrum is kind of like in its infancy, similar to where material science was like 50, 60 years ago, right? And I do recognize that I'm more coming from a traditional RF background. So.
Yeah. So I would second a lot of what Duncan just said. But those, I guess, those are almost innate abilities, or from people. So which certainly are really helpful and look for in hires. But if folks were going to learn something in school on top of that electromagnetics background, one of the things that seems to be lacking when we have folks specifically coming out of undergrad and whatnot is just a real appreciation for the spectrum itself. Kind of getting a sense of, how we're kind of, how it's organized, we have, all the different bands, what they support, how they work, and just the basic notion that, all spectrum is not created equal. They, all the different properties, how propagation differs and so on. And even just a basic understanding of, of differences between higher bands, lower bands, which I find just, at least from undergrad programs, there's very, very, very little of that's ever taught. And we're generally getting people up to speed from ground zero half the time when folks come in and starting from scratch. So if we were able to short circuit that a little bit, that'd be real helpful.
Yeah. So go ahead, Coop.
No, please.
No, I mean, I agree on the interdisciplinary thing. I mean, that's been a harp that I've played for my entire career. And for me, interdisciplinary also involves the economics and the policy aspect of it. I mean, this is a call out to my SpectrumX and Pitt colleagues who study this institutional aspects of how spectrum works. So I think that's an important thing. So good technical grounding, but also an appreciation for the institutional environment and the things that drive policy. What is it that facilitates adoption? I think being able to address those questions. And just to follow on, to get to Maria's question in the chat, what would be the single read? I mean, here I'd have to say Tom Hazlitt's book. I mean, he does such a great job with the history of how we got there. And really, just to follow on Ira's question, I mean, to really understand, get an appreciation for spectrum itself, you can't not understand the history of how we got where we are, because that really informs what we can do going forward and what the constraints are going forward. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
One other aspect as well that I think has been helpful for some of us, and I've seen kind of the real good practitioners in this space is if you've been able to have kind of a foot in both the theoretical and also the kind of the field experience as well. It's one thing to be able to understand the multipath standard deviation, but to actually going out and put eyes on it and do measurements as well. And you can see the effects of multipath when you even go a few feet, and I'm just using that as an example, right? I think that kind of help reflect that, when the model puts out develops a predicted field strength, right? You understand that there's a statistical probability around that. And I think that's kind of helpful to have that understanding. And a lot of times that's through kind of field applications of those measurements.
Thank you all. So Maria Jeleva had a follow-up question in the chat to Islands, which was if you could pick a go-to reading to assign students to up their understanding. Martin mentioned one. Any other go-to books or resources or websites, aside from the SpectrumX website, of course, that we should be directing students to leverage?
Yeah, two of them. Statistical thermodynamics, and only because it really builds up intuition on probability and statistics informing outcomes on the physics. And then a second one is on error propagation, just understanding the fundamentals of measurement and error. And you can do this at home. Most people have 2 or 3 tape measures, line them up next to each other, see how good they are, and then go measure a 2x4 and then figure out whether or not it's really 1.5 by 3.5 inches. And then, you know, measure twice, cut once, but hopefully with a well-calibrated tape measure, I suppose. So those are my 2 go-to readings, besides, you know, your more traditional E&M books.
Thanks, Duncan. We'll try to get those and add them to the website.
Yeah.
Charles?
One other one, and I'll point to my good colleagues at the FCC. The FCC proceedings, you know, going through any NOIs and PRMs, reporting orders on those spectrum issues, excellent reading, right? So I would say that'll be a great baseline, you know, for any, you know, pretty much any band, but you know, there may be bands sort of, you know, that have more interest, but it's sort of understanding the process and the logic, and you know, looking at the different types of interference and the mechanisms. And the FCC, of course, you know, especially the reporting order, having to rely upon you know, the evidence and the documents that went through the public process as well, and how they adjudicated those spot on.
Thanks for the plug, Charles.
I think we want to get a large language model that can distill FCC proceedings documents for the new engineer. That would be like as an acceleration tool, because on first, you know, I've read a number of them. I'm sure that many others are much more comfortable with them than I am, but they're overwhelming with all the footnotes. So they're very exhaustive. I think it'd be great to get like some kind of summarization tool, training wheels, if you will. That's maybe something for us to be thinking about.
And if I could add, sometimes the best information's in those footnotes too, Nick. So
that's what everybody says. But you gotta develop the skill to be able to read those footnotes.
So that's really true of most research papers. All the real details are in the references.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, just, you know, jumping onto that, and as I said, you know, I thank Charles for the plug. But you know, one of the things, and I've had other people tell me, you know, this in some of the commission documents, even if you didn't want to kind of read the full document, the full decision, but understanding how we may have gotten to certain parts, and often our documents follow a certain formula, you know, kind of a brief introduction and a background. And a lot of people have told me those background sections they find really valuable, because they'll lay out the history of a proceeding, and you could go back to read more details if you're interested, but at least you can see the progression of how we kind of got to certain points and certain aspects of decisions without necessarily needing to go into all the little details. And that could be just helpful from getting a bit of a grounding, you know, before you dig real deeply into some of the aspects, just to get a sense, because it's not always real intuitive why the commission makes some of the decisions. And some of it's just based on past experience, what's worked, what hasn't. And then as technology changes and things change, you know, our thinking does have to evolve with that. And we try to do that the best we can. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information that you can find in those documents, those reports and orders, and they're all available on the web.
I think Frank Lind was the next with his hand up.
All right, hello. I have kind of a thing that was touched on earlier that I'd like to get back to, which is to get your comments on the tension between short-term and long-term horizons in research. within the center, we've had a lot of discussions about this because we have kind of the near-term national spectrum strategy we're trying to respond to. Many of the things like NPRMs and so forth are all focused on very short-term response. And yet, in the bigger picture, we're really going to be managing spectrum for hundreds of years more, potentially. And there really is a long time horizon associated with some of the ideas and work and approaches. At the same time, we've got an international treaty process that I would describe as long term, especially compared to the fine scale people would really like to utilize and change the spectrum on. So I'd like your perspective on this and how it relates to our center research.
Yeah, so maybe I'll jump on that first, and others can jump in. I think it's a really good question, and as I said earlier, I think it is a bit of a struggle, and I think some of it might be, in a sense, at least from the commission perspective. We put out our notices of proposed rulemaking, and that sets off a certain time frame for information to come into the commission on a comment period that's often 2 to 3 months. And then to make a final decision could take a couple more months. So it sets off a very short time frame, from a research community standpoint, on being able to participate unless you've already kind of had something in the bag. On the other hand, there may be short-term projects that you can dream up based on what the commission has proposed to fit in, right off the bat. But for a longer term, I think some of the issues that we've talked about, particularly spectrum sharing, you talk about international. One of the things people are focused on today is, or for down the road, is how do we deal with communications in space, with what we're calling cislunar around the moon and back and forth, because again, now we're removing ourselves from the Earth. There's a potential to interfere with communications on Earth, but we also want to create these networks out in space, networks on the moon and wherever. And how can we do that in an efficient way? So that's got a longer time frame. So keeping an eye on some of the things that maybe the ITU and the World Radio Conferences are teeing up for future conferences is kind of a way to think about maybe a bit of a longer term things to focus on that the commission might get around to doing rulemaking on, as the ITU WRC makes some decisions, in every 4 years. And the other thing I think to look at that could be insightful might be some of the projects that are being done in the FCC's Technological Advisory Committee. So we have our TAC, that's a federal advisory committee that we've got that is just finishing up its term. We'll recharter that probably in September. And we ask folks in the industry and to basically help advise us on things we should be looking at, things we should be thinking about that we don't often look at. So, and all of that gets, their presentations and work gets published. And those also might be more mid-range to long-range type things that we're asking some of the CTOs and CIOs and tech leaders around the country to weigh in on, things we should be looking at, how we should be approaching. And so I think maybe those can help as a bit of a guideline for trying to bridge the gap between research and the regulatory side.
Thanks, Ira. Others? I'm sure that's a struggle for you, Duncan, and for ITS in the NTIA, this tension between short-term and long-term.
Yeah, certainly. I think the way that we tend to deal with it from a practical implementation perspective is, we've got short-term projects. They really need insights and capabilities that might already exist in a longer-term project. So what we usually ask is some of the project leaders who are on longer-term horizons to consult with us, come in for 6 to 8 months, appreciate the speed and the dynamics of these projects, but then also bring some of the longer-term vision to the research goals that they're interested in. And at the outset of, some of the short-term projects that particularly NASA has done, we generate an overwhelming amount of data. but it's very difficult to really pick up and go after that nuance or go after a certain detail that you were always interested in as part of having joined that project, because the next short-term thing comes in. So typically what we do is we tend to split the groups. We say there's a long-term R&D group and there's a short-term R&D group. It's not a very elegant solution, and I wish there was a more elegant solution to it. That's a more practical-minded way of how we implemented things within CTL currently.
Thank you. Well, we are at time.
I do have a question.
Oh.
I do have a question for my fellow panelists. I started my career with as a graduate student with NASA, so space is near and dear to my heart. And I was in deployments of cellular systems on the moon. So my question is then squarely, does NTIA then own the prop models for lunar propagation and statistics?
Yep. So I think that question's for me, Duncan. So, you know, I would say NTIA's OSM philosophy is that we put everything, you know, for in GitHub and for sharing as much as possible. Right. You know, that's our kind of our philosophy from that aspect, is to kind of sharing that where, you know, we're not bound by sensitive issues. So I don't have the specific answer to that question, but that's our overall philosophy.
Thank you.
Charles, I heard you were going to go up there to make measurements.
Oh.
Talk about field work.
Boy, Ira, I thought we got along with one another. After the moon.
I mean, I bet we could get a lot of folks to volunteer for field work on that propagation study.
Yeah.
Well, as a Notre Dame professor, I thought sure I would be able to sneak in a question about the Golden Dome. But we're at time. So let me just thank our panelists so much for joining us, especially at this very busy time for all of them. Let's give them all a round of applause. And if it's okay with you, if we collect additional questions, we might send them your way to see if we can dig a little deeper on some of these issues.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Always happy to engage with the SpectrumX community.
Thank you all. Well, I hope you stick around. We're going to take a break for about a half hour, and then we're going to be transitioning to a bunch of our research presentations for the rest of the afternoon. But again, thank you all for your time and your collaborations, and we'll be staying in touch.